For today's shipwreck video, we'll be changing the format a little bit. The actual shipwreck portion will be like Tirpitz or Mutsu, focused on the salvage of a battleship sunk in shallow water. However, there will be a bit more put on the sinking this time around, because this is a sinking that still comes up with conspiracy theories almost 70 years later. While the simplest answer is probably the official one given by the Soviets, that doesn't stop the theories, ranging from Italian frogmen playing James Bond to hidden explosives going off a decade late, or alternatively, both of those together. It's pretty much impossible to say with any real certainty. Nonetheless, I'll cover that sinking in this video, along with the salvage of the wreck, beginning, of course, with the sinking, and a little bit of background on how the ship ended up in that position. You see, the battleship Novorossiysk began her life under a different flag, the Italian flag to be specific, as the battleship Giulio Cesare, probably one of the most famous Italian battleships, not named Roma, because of her engagement with Warspite at Calabria for the historical aspect, and for being an utterly broken, in the best way possible, mess in World of Warships for the more modern look. All joking aside, however, Cesare is a pretty well-known ship, including the fact she was transferred to the Soviet Navy in the aftermath of the Second World War. I've covered the reason for this in my Axis War Prize video, which I'll link in the description. The Cliff Notes version is the Red Navy wanted any modern ships they could get their hands on, or at least any capable warships at all. This would see them obtain several German and Japanese warships, but also some Italian ones. The most notable, of course, being Cesare and Duca d'Aosta, Novorossiysk and Kerch, as they were respectively renamed. The history of the latter is covered in the aforementioned War Prize video. As for the battleship, well, Cesare was handed over in pretty poor shape. The ship had languished for years without proper maintenance, even before the handover. And the Italians were, as could be expected, not exactly happy about giving up the ship. As a result, only the absolutely critical maintenance was performed for the handover. Cesare was made ready to sail, but nothing beyond that. The ship had wartime camouflage, faded as that was, on the superstructure, and the rest of the paint was a mess, put on more to cover rust spots than anything else. And there were plenty of rust spots to go around. Regardless, Cesare, Novorossiysk, was handed over on February 6, 1949 in Albania, where her service in the Red Navy was rough. That service formally began on March 5th of 1949. As you could probably expect, the ship was a maintenance nightmare. Novorossiysk would constantly break down, with various bits of equipment outright failing to operate. This ranged from minor to really quite serious breakdowns. Probably the best visualization of how bad this was comes from the drydock periods. Between 1949 and 1955, or 6 years if you prefer that, this ship needed no fewer than 8 refits. Most were fairly minor, admittedly, but that's not a good record to have. Even for a ship intended for training future battleship crews, this wasn't a good look. The most notable of these took place in 1953. The machinery had broken down so badly by this point that the Red Navy threw up its hands and basically said, "I give up, tear it all out, and replace everything." The old boilers and turbines, dating back to the 1937 rebuild, were finally replaced. Those had been worn down by 16 years of use and lacking maintenance. So, at bare minimum, the turbines were torn out and replaced with new Soviet models. The boilers might have been replaced too, or just overhauled, but sources aren't entirely clear on that topic. Either way, this was a major investment for what amounted to an obsolete ship, and it was matched by follow-up refits lasting into early 1955 that replaced the anti-aircraft battery and other more minor equipment. All of these different stints in drydock took their toll. Most of the ship's remaining service was spent in some form of refit. In fact, the last of them ended on March 29th of 1955. This is relevant because on October 29th, 1955, Novorossiysk suffered a massive explosion in Sevastopol. And this is where the story gets complicated. The explosion came at 1:31 a.m. on October 29th. This rang out directly beneath the starboard bow, with estimates ranging as high as 2,600 pounds of TNT equivalent. This not only blew a massive hole into the bottom, it also blasted clean through the interior decks, with the force ultimately venting out just ahead of the forward triple turret. This was fatal damage. Many of the internal frames were broken, and bulkheads were warped, to the point that watertight doors couldn't close, further worsening already severe flooding. This actually wouldn't be surprising, because the explosion occurred right where the new bow was grafted on the old one. This was different to the Andrea Doria rebuilds, which built an entirely new bow. Cesare's rebuild saw the Italians put a new bow over the old one. This is also relevant to some conspiracy theories later on. For now, the situation aboard the ship was understandably chaotic. Upwards of 3,500 tons of water had entered the battleship by the time the crew tried to move her. With a starboard list developing, the old warhorse had her anchor chains cut. Tugs began to tow the ship to shore, while the list continued to worsen. Despite this, the situation seemed under control. The list wasn't developing at a rapid rate, and the commander of the Black Sea Fleet believed the ship would settle upright. In fairness, the commander, Admiral Alexandrovich Parkhomenko, had good reason to believe that. Sevastopol's harbor was quite shallow in that area. However, it was deceptive because the harbor also had soft mud and silt for the bottom, down to as deep as 15 meters. Moreover, the admiral was operating on the assumption that only about 1,200 tons of water had entered the ship. Bad, but not catastrophic. Unfortunately for the crew of Novorossiysk, the situation began to worsen. By 3:25 a.m., men were being pulled off. However, the admiral, by now in charge of the salvage operation, refused to let all the crew, or at least those not involved in damage control, be removed. He was still convinced the ship would sink upright, and that evacuation would cause unnecessary panic. This led to upwards of 800 men being left on the deck as the ship continued to list. They were just moved back towards the midships area because the boiler rooms had yet to flood. In fact, the ship even made an effort to build up steam. Through it all, that list grew worse, and at some point, it began to shift from starboard to the port side. By 3:50, the list had reached 11 degrees to port and was increasing at a rapid pace. By 4 a.m., it had reached 17 degrees. Then, 10 minutes later, it passed the 18-degree stability limit. And at 4:14, as men jumped overboard, the ship reached 21 degrees to port before suddenly rolling over entirely. This threw men around and made the safe spaces no longer safe. Only about 3 hours after the explosion, Novorossiysk had collapsed to port, and she would continue to settle deeper into the mud as the day went on. That sudden shift to port at some point was probably due to flooded compartments and shifting of water as the ship sank. Either way, the battleship was on the bottom, and 608 or 609 Soviet sailors went down with her. Around 100 in the initial blast, and the rest from the sinking. The worst peacetime disaster in Soviet naval history. Almost immediately after the sinking, an inquiry began into what caused it. It was quickly apparent that the blast wasn't due to faulty shells or powder. The closest magazine, that of A turret, was intact. The wreck itself also indicated an external explosion. The damage to the bottom included plates bent inwards. An internal explosion would have bent those outwards. Furthermore, the damage pattern mentioned earlier fits an external explosion. The blast blew up from the bottom before venting from the top. There was no indication of an internal detonation, blowing out in all directions. Granted, I'm not an explosive expert by any stretch of the imagination, so if anyone in the comments is and can dispute the point, by all means let me know. I'm always open to new information. From my own understanding, and from reading, it does seem like the explosion does not match an internal one. In any event, this investigation, by General Vyacheslav Malyshev, found their culprit, specifically an unexploded German mine left over from when they evacuated occupied Sevastopol. This would have been an RMH magnetic mine, basically a wooden box filled with about 2,000 pounds of TNT equivalent, pretty close to the estimated force of the blast. The Germans put a lot of these mines into the harbor. The Soviets swept the harbor multiple times from 1945 through to 1951. And yet, after a further sweep in the aftermath of the sinking, they still found more, including 3 within 50 meters of Novorossiysk's mooring. Now, this theory is not without flaws. Those mines should have been inactive 11 years after they were placed. Outliers are certainly possible, of course, and Italian battleships speculates that maybe that particular mine had a malfunction after it was laid, which was cleared the night Novorossiysk moored above it, prompting it to finally detonate. The mine theory is also supported by the presence of a large crater in the bottom right beneath the damage. This is all speculation, mind you. The mine theory isn't perfect, not least because other ships, and Novorossiysk herself, had moored there before, and the mine was past the point its fuse should have failed. Nonetheless, it is the most likely, especially in the face of how outlandish the conspiracy theories can get. These typically revolve around the Italians, the most common being the claim that bitter Italian frogmen repeated their success against Valiant and Queen Elizabeth. These men would have snuck into the harbor, placed explosives, and detonated them. This is typically based on claims by various Italians over the years, and by Giulio Borghese, who planned the attack on the British ships. He became a politician after the war, who notably swore vengeance on the Soviet Navy. However, this entire situation is right out of a James Bond movie, and not in the realistic way. This would have required those Italians to sneak across the Black Sea into Sevastopol. Not just that, but to get past all security measures with a massive pile of explosives, along with the equipment to carry it, most likely mini submarines. The frogmen would then have to place the explosives, get out, and do it all without being caught or leaving any evidence behind. Let's ignore for the moment that the Italian government would have been very silly to authorize something like this. The ex-Cesare was useless and a relic, not worth the effort over a decade after the war had ended. Let's say instead that this was instigated by naval officers, probably retired ones, and without the government's authorization. That makes it even less likely because now you've got both the Soviets and the Italian government somehow not catching wind of this. And the Turkish government too, because they would have had to pass by the Bosporus. It boggles the mind to think that frogmen could pull off sinking into and out of the harbor without any conclusive evidence ever coming to light. There's an article by the U.S. Naval Institute that does note a KGB operative claiming to have found a magnetic mine at Kerch, the ex-Italian cruiser's berth, set to explode on November 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution. However, I've never seen this mentioned anywhere else, so take that with a heaping pile of salt, especially with Russian records being what they are. Now, there were lapses in security. Both books and the aforementioned article note this, but lapses in security does not equate to Italians bomb the ship, and all of this seems to originate with a Russian author in the 1990s, V.A. Karsavin. While this did find the security lapses, it's still incredibly hard to believe the Italians pulled this off. In any case, to wrap up the conspiracy theories, there's also the claim there were 2 explosions. This is typically cited to claim the Bond villain Frogman only placed a small charge on the hull. This was placed beneath the joints in the old and new bows, because the Italians had hidden a massive charge there where the Soviets wouldn't think to look. This hadn't gone off as planned, so the Frogmen went in. They detonated a smaller charge, which cooked off the larger one. This is also rather unlikely, both that the Soviets never found this during all those refits, or that the Italians would do this in the first place. Any ships lost to sabotage had to be replaced. That was part of the treaty. If they had done this with the intention of it happening sooner, they'd just lose another battleship. Not to mention, again, the explosion looks like an external one, not an internal blast. That said, this is still less outlandish than claims that the British were the ones to mine the ship. For some reason, I guess? Let me be clear here. These theories of sabotage can't be ruled out entirely. This is a mystery that can probably never be solved. However, it strains my belief to the breaking point to accept the plot of a Bond film as the actual culprit. The mine theory isn't perfect, but it makes a lot more sense. As for the internal explosion, or the British option, those seem to primarily be the Russian equivalent of bored military bloggers. I haven't found a single serious source even remotely supporting this. But, as it does crop up here and there, I figured it was worth mentioning, because if I didn't, it would probably pop up in the comments, even though it's a Mount Everest of salt. Regardless, that brings us to the end of the sinking. Let's take a brief look at the salvage to round things off, and for those here for the shipwreck itself. This began by burrowing tunnels beneath the hull. This would allow cables to run around the ship for the salvage process. You can see the pipeline for the sluice used here to create those tunnels, and the structure built atop the hull to help with the salvage. Meanwhile, holes were drilled into the hull to pump in compressed air, while other openings, including inside the blast damage, were made watertight, either by welding or with concrete. This was by no means an easy process. Just looking at the hole where the blast damaged the ship makes that apparent. You can see how deep that went and how big it was. Also, for that matter, the inward bent plates. Even the port side seen here was pretty beat up, from both blast damage and from bulkheads failing as the ship turned over. While the shape of the stem is apparent, the rest of the ship is caved in, right, again, around where the new bow was grafted on the old. Before we reach the refloating, there's also this picture of the stern, where you can see part of the ship cut open to try and rescue men stuck below decks. This effort did save 7 sailors, although only those 7. As for the salvage itself, we can see that start here, including the compressed air tanks and hoses. The ship itself is barely visible beneath all of this. You can see the pontoons attached to the cables beneath the ship. You can see tugs, tanks, and hoses, but only part of the hull here is visible. This effort took 24 compressors and 4 hours, and proved to be a success. The Soviets pulled the ship from the bottom, although they made no effort to right the hulk. She remained upside down, much like her sister ship Leonardo da Vinci decades before. Although, as you can see here with the ship under tow, it wasn't that far out of the water. The props are still almost underwater at this point. Still, the ship was afloat, and could be moved to a new mooring where the hull could be scrapped. Structures were erected atop the hull as crews began to cut in. You can see those structures here, along with the inward bent plates here. You can also see more of the buckled port side and the blast damage in this shot. It's not pretty, even with the ship off the bottom. As for the actual salvage work, that focused on the ammunition first. You can see them cutting into the hull to access the magazines, which shows completely intact shell storage with the shells still in place. I'm not sure which magazine this is, admittedly, but still. No explosion here. Once that ammo was out, the rest of the hulk was scrapped. You can't see much detail here other than how that process was done in the harbor, including what looks like a couple waterborne cranes. This shot, on the other hand, is striking. That new bow lifted out of the water and resting vertically. It's much like the similar shot from the Tirpitz wreck. A sad end for a proud ship, by all accounts. The last picture for its part is of the main guns, one of the twin turrets to be specific. These were apparently intact enough that they could have been used as shore artillery. However, this was never done, and the guns were scrapped with the turrets sometime in the 1970s. Thus ends the story of Giulio Cesare and of Novorossiysk, a mystery that will probably never be solved, and a ship that sank in a foreign harbor well after her war had ended. Although, as a final postscript, as could be expected, metaphorical heads rolled after this was done. Many officers were punished for the failures in saving the ship, up to and including the head of the Soviet Navy itself, Admiral Kuznetsov, who was forced into retirement. He was later rehabilitated, but it's worth noting. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.